They say one moment can change everything. One wrong step. One stolen glance. Have you ever felt invisible in your own home? Like you could disappear and no one would even notice? Like you're playing a role instead of living your life? Because if you have, then maybe, just maybe, you'll understand why I did what I did. But I need to warn you. This story, it doesn't end the way you think it will. And by the time I finish telling it, you might not even know whose side you're on. But one thing is for sure, after this, you'll never look at trust the same way again. Subscribe now to hear the stories no one else dares to tell. Because sometimes the truth is uglier than the lie. And sometimes the person you betray the most is yourself. Loneliness is a strange thing. It doesn't hit you all at once. It creeps in slowly, like a fog rolling over your life. One day, you wake up and realize you're alone, even when there are people all around you. That's exactly how I felt in my own marriage. At first, I told myself it was normal. That this is just what happens when you've been married long enough. That the passion, the excitement, the feeling of being wanted, it all just fades. But what happens when you realize you don't just miss the passion? You miss being seen, being noticed, being more than just a shadow in someone else's life. That was my reality. My husband, Daniel, was a provider in every sense of the word. He made good money. We lived in a beautiful home, one of those houses that looked like something out of a magazine. Polished floors, perfectly arranged furniture, expensive paintings on the walls. But no amount of expensive things can fill the emptiness of a cold marriage. Daniel was always busy. At first, it was just late nights at work. Then it was business trips, meetings, dinners, phone calls that never seemed to end. And somewhere along the way, we just stopped trying. Stopped talking about anything other than bills, schedules, and whatever meaningless small talk filled the silence at the dinner table. I tried. I really did. There were nights I would put on something nice, try to cook his favorite meal, set the table like I used to when we first got married. But he'd walk in exhausted, barely glancing at me as he muttered, "I already ate." Other nights, he'd be in the same room, but a million miles away, face buried in his laptop, answering emails like I wasn't even there. And eventually, I stopped trying too. Because what's the point of screaming into a void that never answers back? That's when I started to feel it, that slow, aching numbness. The kind that makes you forget what it feels like to be wanted, to be touched, to have someone look at you like you matter. And then, Adam moved in. Adam, 19 years old. My husband's son from his first marriage. He had been living with his mother all these years, but she had just moved abroad, and Daniel thought it would be easier for Adam to stay with us while he attended college. I'll admit, at first, I barely noticed him. He was polite, quiet, kept to himself. The kind of kid who always had his headphones in, lost in his own world. But then, something shifted. Maybe it was because he was always there, present in ways my husband wasn't. Maybe it was because, unlike Daniel, Adam actually saw me. It started off small. Little things. A good morning when we crossed paths in the kitchen. A casual, "need help with that," when I struggled with grocery bags. At first, I thought nothing of it. But then, I started noticing him too. The way his eyes lingered on me just a second longer than they should. The way his voice softened when he spoke to me, different from how he spoke to anyone else. The way his presence filled the silence I had grown so used to. And for the first time in years, I felt something I wasn't supposed to. I felt alive. The house had always felt too big, too empty. The kind of place where sound gets lost, where laughter feels out of place. But with Adam there, it felt different. Not warmer, not happier, just different. There were nights when Daniel was away on business trips, and I'd find myself in the kitchen, sipping tea in the dim glow of the stove light, only to realize I wasn't alone. Adam would be there too, sitting at the counter, scrolling through his phone. And slowly, those quiet moments turned into conversations. At first, they were about nothing, safe topics. His classes, his professors, how different it felt living here. But then, one night, he said something that caught me off guard. "You seem lonely." I froze. Not because he was wrong. but because no one had said it out loud before. I laughed it off, told him he was imagining things. But the way he looked at me, he knew. And maybe, just maybe, that's where it all really started. After that, something changed. The way we looked at each other. The way our conversations lasted just a little longer each night. The way my heart started beating faster whenever I heard footsteps coming down the hallway. It wasn't just me anymore. I could feel it, he felt it too. It was in the way his eyes followed me when he thought I wasn't looking. In the way he hesitated just a second too long when he brushed past me. And then, one night, something happened that neither of us could ignore. A moment that should have never happened. A moment that changed everything. I should have walked away. I should have stopped it before it began. But I didn't. And that's where the real story begins. Because once you open a door like that, you can never close it again. It was late. One of those nights where sleep felt impossible, where the silence in the house felt too heavy to ignore. I found myself in the kitchen, standing by the stove, watching the water heat for tea. The dim light cast a soft glow over the countertops, and for the first time that day, I felt at peace. Or at least, I thought I did. Then I heard footsteps. Soft, barefoot, unrushed. And before I even turned around, I knew who it was. Can't sleep? His voice was lower than usual, still laced with exhaustion from the day. I glanced over my shoulder, offering a small smile. Something like that. Adam walked past me, opening the fridge, his presence filling the quiet space between us. Me neither, he muttered, grabbing a bottle of water. For a moment, there was nothing but the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the soft bubbling of the water in the kettle. We weren't speaking. But we weren't not speaking either. It was a comfortable kind of silence. Or at least, that's what I told myself. My dad's gone again, huh? His words were casual, but there was something underneath them, something bitter, something unspoken. I hesitated, pretending to be too focused on the steam rising from the kettle. He had another last-minute meeting. Adam let out a dry, humorless laugh. Of course he did. I glanced at him then. There was something in his expression, something tired. He was always like that, you know, he said, leaning against the counter. When I was a kid, I used to wait by the door for him to come home. But he never did. Not really. Not in the way that mattered. I swallowed, suddenly unsure of what to say. Because the truth was, I understood. Too well. You ever feel like you could disappear and no one would notice? He asked, voice softer now. I inhaled sharply. Because for the first time in a long time, someone had put words to exactly how I felt. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Because when I looked at him, and he looked at me, I knew he already understood. The kettle clicked off, breaking the tension hanging between us. I turned back to it, reaching for the cabinet to grab a mug. And that's when it happened. Adam reached for one at the same time. Our hands met. It was nothing. A simple accident. A brief touch, but neither of us moved. His fingers curled slightly, as if he was testing something, testing me. And for a second, just one, fleeting second, I let it happen. I let myself feel it. The warmth of his skin, the way my breath caught in my throat. It was wrong. I knew that. But it had been so long since I had felt anything other than emptiness. And maybe that's why I didn't pull away fast enough. Because in that moment, for the first time in years, I felt seen. Then, reality snapped back into place. I yanked my hand away, too quickly, too obviously, and turned back to my tea as if nothing had happened. Sorry, he said, his voice unreadable. I forced a small laugh. No big deal. But it was a big deal. It was too big of a deal. Because when I dared to glance up at him, I realized something terrifying. He had felt it too. The air between us was different now, charged, waiting. And that moment? That moment should have been where I stepped away, where I reminded myself of boundaries. But I didn't. I let the moment linger. I let the feeling sink in. And I let myself wonder, just for a second, what would happen if I didn't walk away? Because once he let that thought in, once he let the line blur, there's no going back. It was harmless, wasn't it? I wasn't doing anything wrong. I told myself that over and over again. It was just a conversation. Just a touch. Just a lingering glance. It didn't mean anything. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. But if it was so harmless, why did my heart race every time he walked into the room? Why did I catch myself waiting for the moments when we'd cross paths? Why did I notice him in ways I shouldn't? Daniel came home late again that night. I heard the front door creak open, the sound of his keys dropping onto the table. Same routine, same indifference. I was sitting on the couch, a book open in my lap, but I hadn't read a single word. My thoughts were too tangled, my mind still caught in the moment that had happened just hours before. "Hey," I said, forcing a small smile. "Hey," he muttered back, already unbuttoning his dress shirt as he walked past me. No kiss on the cheek. No "how was your day?" No sign that he even noticed I was sitting there, waiting for him. "How was your trip?" I asked, still trying. Still hoping. "Exhausting," he said, rubbing his temples. "I just need a shower." And just like that, the conversation was over. He didn't ask about me. Didn't wonder if I was okay, if I'd had a good day, if I'd missed him. It was always like this. Like we were two ghosts occupying the same space, moving around each other, but never really seeing each other. And it hit me then, harder than usual. He didn't love me the way he used to. Maybe he didn't even see me at all. The next morning, I was in the kitchen again, making breakfast when Adam walked in. "Morning," he said, voice still thick with sleep. "Morning," I replied, forcing my voice to sound normal, like I wasn't thinking about the night before. He moved past me, opening the fridge, and I thought, this is fine. This is normal. Nothing has changed. But then he looked at me. Really looked at me. "You okay?" he asked. 2 words. 2 simple words. But they stopped me in my tracks. Because when was the last time anyone had asked me that? When was the last time someone noticed when I wasn't okay? I swallowed. Forced a smile. "Yeah. Just tired." His eyes lingered on me for a second too long. "He's gone again, huh?" I nodded, pretending to focus on my coffee, pretending that the way he was looking at me wasn't making my pulse quicken. "He doesn't appreciate you," Adam said, voice quieter now. I shouldn't have let that statement sit. I should have shut it down right then and there. But I didn't. Instead, I let those words sink into me like warmth against cold skin. Instead, I let myself feel them. And that was my first mistake. After that night, something between us shifted. It wasn't anything obvious. Not at first. It was just small things. Things that could have meant nothing, but somehow they did. Adam started seeking me out more. If I was cooking, he'd come into the kitchen, offering to help. If I was carrying groceries, he'd take the bags from my hands before I could protest. If I was sitting outside with a book, he'd join me, making casual conversation, asking questions that no one else ever asked. "What's your favorite movie? Did you always want to live here, or did you dream about somewhere else? If you could change one thing about your life, what would it be?" They were innocent questions. But they felt like something more. Because he was paying attention. Because he wanted to know me. And my God, when was the last time anyone had wanted to know me? But every time I let myself feel that pull, that warmth, that ache, guilt came crashing down right after. I was his stepmother. This was wrong. I told myself that over and over again. And yet, that didn't stop my heart from racing every time he got too close. It didn't stop the way my breath caught when his fingers grazed mine accidentally. It didn't stop the way my stomach flipped when I saw his name pop up on my phone. This was dangerous. I knew it. But knowing something and feeling something, those are 2 very different things. And sometimes, the heart doesn't give a damn about right or wrong. One evening, I was sitting on the couch, flipping through a magazine but not really reading it. Adam walked in and sat down across from me, stretching out, looking completely at ease. "Long day?" he asked. I nodded. "Yeah. Want to talk about it?" His voice was soft, easy, like he actually cared. Like he actually wanted to hear what I had to say. And that was dangerous. Because I wanted to talk. I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to lean in instead of pulling away. Instead, I smiled. "No, it's nothing." And then, He reached out, gently tucking a stray piece of hair behind my ear. It was so small, so innocent. But the moment his fingertips brushed my skin, something inside me snapped. My heart stopped. My breath hitched. And the way he was looking at me? Like I was someone worth looking at. It was the most dangerous thing of all. I should have walked away. I should have ended it right there. But I didn't. And that was the moment everything changed. After that night, after that tiny, dangerous moment, things began to shift. Not in a loud, obvious way, but in the kind of way that sneaks up on you, thread by thread, until you're wrapped in something you can't escape from. It was in the way he looked at me. Across the dinner table. Across the room. Everywhere. Like I was someone worth looking at. Like I was his secret. And I knew, God, I knew, that I should stop it. But I didn't. It started with small things. A brush of his fingers against mine when passing a plate. A lingering glance when no one else was looking. A text. A single message. You seem lonely. I see you. I read it at least a dozen times, my hands trembling. And for a moment, my mind screamed at me to delete it. To ignore it. To pretend I never saw it. But instead, I kept it. I didn't respond. I didn't have to. Because we both knew what was happening. And that was the real problem. It was late again. The house was quiet. I was folding laundry, trying to distract myself from the thoughts clawing at my mind, when I heard his voice. Hey! I turned. Adam was standing at his door, leaning against the frame, his expression unreadable. Can you help me with something? My heart skipped. With what? Just something in my room. It'll only take a second. Everything in me screamed at me to say no. To make an excuse. To leave. But I didn't. Instead, I followed him inside. And when I stepped in, he closed the door behind me. Softly. Quietly. Intentionally. The air was thick. So thick I could barely breathe. What do you need help with? I asked, forcing my voice to stay even. Adam didn't answer. Instead, he watched me. His eyes scanned my face, my lips, like he was trying to memorize every single detail. And then, he stepped closer. Too close. I could feel his warmth. Hear his breathing. And in that moment, every single warning sign flashed in my mind. This was the moment. The last chance to stop. To walk away. To end whatever this was before it destroyed everything. And then, he did something I never expected. He reached out. And touched my face. Softly. Gently. Like he was waiting for me to stop him. Like he was testing to see how far he could go before I pulled away. But I didn't. I should have. I should have stepped back. I should have said no. But instead I let him. His thumb grazed my cheek, and my eyes closed on their own. It had been so long since anyone touched me like that. Since anyone looked at me like that. Since I felt wanted. The space between us disappeared. A breath. A second. A choice. I didn't know who moved first. I didn't know if it was him, if it was me, if it was something pulling us together that neither of us could control. All I knew was that everything else disappeared. And in that moment, there was no husband. No rules. No logic. Just us. A mistake. A beautiful, terrible, inescapable mistake. And once we crossed that line, there was no going back. I couldn't breathe. The moment his lips left mine, the world snapped back into focus. Like I had been underwater, drowning in something too deep, too dark, only to come up gasping, panicked, realizing what I'd just done. I stepped back so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. My voice cracked. I couldn't even form words. Adam's eyes searched mine, his breathing still heavy, his hands still hovering near me like he wasn't sure if he should reach for me again or let me go. For a second, he looked hopeful. Like he thought this was just the beginning. Like he thought I was about to say something that would make this okay. But I wasn't. Because nothing about this was okay. I have to go. It was all I could manage before I turned and fled. I avoided him after that. I had to. Every part of me was screaming to put as much distance between us as possible, to pretend like it never happened. Like it was just a moment of weakness, a fleeting, desperate mistake. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself of that, I couldn't. Because every time I closed my eyes, I could still feel him. The warmth of his hands. The way he had looked at me, like I was his. And that was what scared me the most. Not that it had happened, but that some part of me wanted it to happen. That some part of me still did. Adam changed after that night. Or maybe I did. At first, he tried to act like nothing was different, like we could just go back to the way things were. But I wouldn't let him. I wouldn't look at him. Wouldn't speak unless I had to. Wouldn't let myself be alone with him. But he was always there, watching me, studying me. And then, just like that, he stopped. His eyes that once followed me now avoided me. His voice that once sounded so warm now carried a cold edge. His presence that once felt like an invitation now felt like a warning. And somehow, that hurt more than anything. I wasn't the only one who noticed the shift. Daniel, my husband, the man who had spent years ignoring me, suddenly started paying attention. "You okay?" he asked one evening as I cleared the dinner plates. I nearly dropped the dish in my hands. Because when was the last time he had even asked me that? "I'm fine," I said quickly, forcing a smile. He frowned, studying me like he was actually seeing me for the first time in years. "You've been acting different lately." Panic flared in my chest. Did he know? No. He couldn't. There was no way. "Just tired," I lied, turning away before he could look too closely. But the truth was, I was exhausted. Exhausted from pretending nothing had happened. Exhausted from the ache in my chest every time I saw Adam. Exhausted from wanting something I could never have. I thought things would just fade away. That if I ignored it long enough, whatever had happened between Adam and me would eventually disappear. But I was wrong. Because you can't just erase a moment like that. You can't just pretend it didn't change everything. And I learned that the hard way the night Adam finally snapped. It was late. The house was dark. I had just stepped out of my room, heading toward the kitchen for a glass of water, when I nearly ran straight into him. He was standing there in the hallway waiting. His face was unreadable. But his eyes, God, his eyes. "Are you ever gonna talk to me again?" His voice was quiet, low, dangerous. I swallowed hard, every part of me screaming to run. "Adam, please. This can't what?" His jaw clenched. "Can't happen?" Because it already did. Silence. Thick, unbearable, electric silence. And then, before I could stop myself, I whispered the one question that had been haunting me since that night in his room. "Do you regret it?" His breath hitched. And then, so quietly it was almost a confession, no. The air between us crackled. Every wall I had built, every line I had drawn gone. Because in that moment, we both knew this wasn't over. And maybe it never would be. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the way he had looked at me in the hallway. By the way my name had felt in his mouth, low, raw, almost like a plea. By the way I had asked him that question. "Do you regret it?" By the way he had answered. No. I turned onto my side, squeezing my eyes shut, willing the memory away. But it wouldn't go. It wouldn't leave me alone. Because the truth was, I didn't regret it either. And that was the part that terrified me. What kind of person even entertains these thoughts? What kind of person crosses that line and still wants to go back for more? I used to think I knew who I was. A wife. A woman who had sacrificed so much to hold a marriage together. A good person. But was I? Was I really? Or was I just as bad as Daniel? Maybe worse. Because while he had abandoned me emotionally, I had done something far worse. I had betrayed him in a way that couldn't be undone. And the cruelest part? I still wasn't sure if I wanted to stop. I tried to tell myself that what had happened was just a mistake. That it had been a moment of weakness, nothing more. But mistakes don't come with replays in your head every time you close your eyes. Mistakes don't linger on your skin like a ghost of a touch, reminding you how it felt. How it made you feel alive. Mistakes don't leave you wanting more. And that was what I couldn't shake. Because deep down, beneath all the guilt and shame, there was something else. Something I wasn't ready to admit. Something I was afraid of. Because what if it wasn't just a mistake? What if it was the truth I had been avoiding all along? That Adam wasn't just filling a void. That I wanted him. Not just because I was lonely. Not just because Daniel had made me feel invisible. But because, somewhere along the way, he had become the only thing I could feel anymore. I thought about telling someone. A friend. A stranger. Hell, even Daniel. Because maybe if I said it out loud, if I let the words breathe, it would become real. And if it became real, maybe I could finally kill it. Maybe I could finally make it stop. But who could I tell? Who would understand? Who would forgive me? Because I wasn't even sure I could forgive myself. And yet, as much as I hated myself for it, as much as I wanted to lock the thoughts away and never let them out again, I couldn't stop wondering, what if? What if I hadn't run? What if, instead of pulling away, I had let myself lean in? What if I had let my hands tangle in his hair, let his lips find mine again, let the night swallow us whole? Would it have been wrong? Of course. But would it have felt right? I shivered at the thought, the weight of it curling around me like something I couldn't escape. Because that was the thing about temptation. It never yelled. It never demanded. It whispered. Softly. Sweetly. Like a hand at the back of your neck, gently pulling you closer, telling you it was okay. Telling you that maybe, just maybe, you weren't falling. You were flying. I should have known that night in the hallway wouldn't be the last time. That no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, to bury it, to convince myself that it was over, it wasn't. Because Adam wasn't avoiding me anymore. Not completely. He wasn't pushing anymore. He was waiting. Watching. Letting me decide. And the truth? I didn't know what scared me more, the thought of him stopping, or the thought of me finally giving in. Have you ever felt alone, even when you weren't? Not the kind of alone where you're sitting in an empty room, but the kind where you're surrounded by people, and yet, no one really sees you. Because that's what I felt. Day after day. Night after night. Until he looked at me. Until he made me feel something I hadn't felt in years. And now? Now, I don't even know who I am anymore. Was this just a moment of weakness? A slip? A mistake? A lonely heart clinging to the first person who made it feel alive again? Or was it something deeper? Something I've been trying to ignore for too long? Something that was always there, just waiting to be set free? And that's what I want to ask you. Because I know I can't be the only one who has felt this way. I can't be the only one who has looked at their life and wondered, is this it? The routine. The silence. The slow, suffocating realization that the person you built your world around doesn't even know who you are anymore. Have you ever felt that? That aching, desperate need to be seen? That moment where loneliness makes you crave connection in ways you never thought possible? Maybe you've been there. Maybe you haven't. Maybe you judge me for what I've done. Or maybe you understand exactly how I got here. So tell me, was this just a close call? A single moment of weakness that I can still pull myself back from? Or was it something more? Something inevitable. Something I've been running from for so long that now I'm too tired to fight it anymore? What would you do if you were me? Would you walk away before it's too late? Or would you finally stop running? Because right now, I don't know if I'm strong enough to do the right thing. Whatever that even means anymore. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me, if this were you, if you were standing where I'm standing, would you have stopped yourself? Or would you have let it happen? And if you've ever been through something like this, if you've ever felt this way, I want to hear your story. Because maybe, just maybe, I'm not the only one who has ever been this lost. If you want to hear how this ends, if you need to know whether I choose to walk away or fall deeper, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Because this story isn't over yet. And neither am I. They say the worst betrayals aren't the ones we commit with our bodies, but the ones we commit with our hearts. The thoughts we entertain when no one is watching. The feelings we let linger just a little too long. The line we don't cross, but stand too close to. That's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't always come in the form of an affair. Sometimes it's a look, a whisper, a single moment of hesitation where you almost let go, where you almost let yourself fall. And sometimes, the deepest betrayals aren't about what we do, but what we almost do. What's worse? To be physically unfaithful? Or to want to be? To give in completely? Or to spend every day fighting the urge and still losing in your mind? Because the truth? The moment I stopped myself in that hallway, the moment I pulled away, told myself that I was still in control. I had already lost. Because the desire was there. And once you feel something like that, once you taste it, even for a second, you can't unfeel it. You can't go back to the way things were before. Because now you know. You know what it's like to be wanted. To feel something stir inside you after years of numbness. To look at someone and wonder, what if? What if I had leaned in? What if I had let it happen? What if I had let go? That question never leaves you. And the worst part? You'll never have an answer. Because regret doesn't only come from doing the wrong thing. Sometimes, it comes from wondering if the wrong thing was the only thing that could have made you feel alive again. No one talks about this part. No one talks about what happens when you almost cheat. Because cheating is clear. It's black and white. Right or wrong. But almost? Almost is a shadow that follows you everywhere. Almost is a memory that stains you, even when nothing happened. Almost is guilt without proof. And tell me, how do you confess to something that never even happened? How do you ask for forgiveness? For something that only existed inside of you? How do you punish yourself for a sin you never actually committed? Because I can tell you now, the weight of what almost happened is just as heavy as the weight of what did. And the punishment? It's knowing that you will carry it with you every single day and no one will ever even know. So I'll ask you this. Would you have stopped yourself? If you had been standing where I was, if you had spent years feeling invisible in your own home, if someone finally looked at you like you mattered again, if their touch felt like oxygen after years of drowning, would you have been strong enough to pull away? Or would you have done what I almost did? And tell me this, if I had given in, if I had let it happen, would that have made me worse? Or would it have just made me human? They tell you that love and betrayal are clear-cut, that you should always know the difference between right and wrong. But life isn't a perfect story, and hearts don't follow rules. Sometimes, the hardest choices are the ones you never expected to make. And sometimes, the person you betray the most isn't your husband. It isn't your family. It isn't even the person you almost loved. It's yourself.